My brother laughed at my useless skills. Then a general asked me to translate the classified document. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My brother called my language skills hobby garbage for 15 years. Then a 4-star general walked into a crisis briefing, slammed a classified document on the table, and said the 5 words that made my brother's face go white. We need Aria to translate this. They didn't even give me a proper chair. I sat on a metal folding seat that creaked every time I shifted, surrounded by mahogany tables and leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The Pentagon briefing room smelled like expensive coffee and desperation. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across faces that looked like they hadn't slept in days. 12 high-ranking officials sat in a perfect semicircle, their uniforms pressed to razor-sharp creases, ribbons and stars gleaming under the unforgiving lights. But none of them were looking at their carefully arranged papers or their classified tablets. They were all staring at me, like I was either their salvation or their biggest mistake. Then he walked in like he owned every molecule of oxygen in the building. Lieutenant Colonel Damien Thorne, my older brother, my former best friend, the golden child who'd spent our entire childhood making sure everyone knew exactly how much more successful he was than his dreamer sister. His boots clicked against the polished floor with the kind of precision that made junior officers straighten their spines involuntarily. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to remind everyone in the room exactly who held the power here. He didn't look at me, not once. His steel gray eyes swept the room like a security camera, cataloging every face except mine. He'd perfected that technique over the years, the art of making me invisible in rooms where I didn't belong, which, according to him, was pretty much everywhere that mattered. Damien took his position at the head of the conference table, adjusted his tie with mechanical precision, and opened a leather portfolio that looked like it cost more than my entire wardrobe. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes you count your own heartbeats just to make sure you're still alive. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and condescension that had made my teenage years a living hell. "We're here to address a critical intelligence failure that has put Operation Nightfall at severe risk." Operation Nightfall. I'd never heard the name before, but the way everyone in the room tensed when he said it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just another military briefing. This was the kind of meeting that happened when something had gone catastrophically wrong and someone needed to be held accountable. 3 days ago, Damien continued, clicking open his laptop with practiced efficiency, our signals intelligence team intercepted a series of encrypted communications originating from the Kyrgyzstan border region. The messages were written in a dialect we initially believed to be Standard Farsi. He paused, letting that word hang in the air like a loaded weapon. The officials around the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and I caught a few of them stealing glances in my direction. Something cold started forming in the pit of my stomach. "However," Damien's voice dropped to that dangerously quiet tone he'd used when we were kids, and he was about to destroy one of my projects. "Our translation team has been unable to produce a coherent interpretation. The syntax doesn't match any known Persian variant, and the vocabulary appears to contain elements that don't exist in any of our linguistic databases." A woman in navy blues, Admiral Sarah Kellner, according to her nameplate, leaned forward slightly. "What's our current assessment of the situation, Colonel?" Damien's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Our assessment, Admiral, is that we're dealing with either a sophisticated encryption method designed to look like natural language, or—" He turned his laptop screen toward the room, displaying what looked like a dense block of text in flowing script. "We're looking at a dialect so obscure that our entire intelligence apparatus is essentially blind to it." The text on his screen made my breath catch in my throat. I recognized those flowing letters, those particular grammatical constructions. I'd spent countless hours as a teenager hunched over dusty books in the back corner of the university library, teaching myself to read exactly that script while Damien was at football practice and our parents were working late at the hospital. "Which brings us," Damien continued, his voice taking that particular tone of professional disappointment that had haunted my teenage dinner conversations, "to the question of how we ended up in this position in the first place."
He clicked to the next slide, and my stomach dropped through the floor. It was my academic transcript from Westfield University. My grades, my course listings, my thesis title, all of it displayed like evidence in a criminal trial. "It has come to our attention," Damien said, not even trying to hide the satisfaction in his voice now, "that the Department of Defense has been consulting with civilian contractors who lack proper security clearances and whose expertise may not be as comprehensive as initially represented." The room was so quiet, I could hear the ventilation system humming through the walls. Every pair of eyes in the room was now fixed on me, and I could feel my face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the room temperature.
"Specifically," Damien continued, turning to look directly at me for the first time since he'd entered the room, "we've discovered that certain individuals may have overstated their linguistic qualifications in order to secure consulting contracts they were not qualified to fulfill." I wanted to stand up. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell everyone in that room about the 7 languages I spoke fluently, about the doctoral research I'd conducted on regional dialect variations, about the 3 years I'd spent living with nomadic tribes in the mountains of Central Asia, learning languages that didn't even have names in English. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because sitting in that room, surrounded by uniforms and authority, and my brother's perfectly crafted narrative, all of those accomplishments felt as substantial as smoke. When you're 28 years old and your older brother still introduces you as my sister who plays with languages, it doesn't matter how many degrees you have or how many dialects you can translate, you're still just the dreamer kid who never learned to speak the language that actually mattered. "The question before us today," Damien concluded, closing his laptop with a decisive snap, "is whether we can afford to continue relying on unverified expertise when our national security is at stake." Admiral Kellner nodded slowly. "What do you recommend, Colonel?" Damien straightened his shoulders, and I saw the same expression he'd worn when he told our parents that my plan to major in linguistics was a waste of time and tuition money. "I recommend," he said, his voice carrying across the room like a verdict, "that we terminate all current civilian consulting contracts pending a full review of credentials and implement proper oversight protocols to ensure this kind of intelligence failure never happens again." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. I sat there in my cheap folding chair, wearing a blazer I'd bought at a thrift store, surrounded by people who made decisions that shaped the world, while my brother systematically dismantled everything I'd spent my adult life building. And the worst part was, he was doing it with the same smile he'd worn when we were kids, and he convinced our parents that I was too sensitive for advanced classes, too scattered for serious academic work, too unrealistic to ever make anything of myself. Some things, apparently, never change. The only difference was that now, instead of just destroying my confidence at family dinner, he was doing it in front of people who could destroy my entire career with a single phone call. But what Damien didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the text on his screen, the indecipherable dialect that had stumped the entire intelligence community, was as clear to me as the morning newspaper. And if they'd given me 5 minutes instead of staging this public execution, I could have told them exactly what those intercepted messages said, who had written them, and why the Department of Defense should be very, very worried about what was coming next. The worst part wasn't the public humiliation. It was the way Damien looked at me, like I was a stray dog that had somehow wandered into a 5-star restaurant and needed to be quietly removed before the real guests arrived. He moved through that briefing room like he was conducting a symphony of power, every gesture calculated to remind everyone exactly who belonged there and who didn't. When he adjusted his collar, 3 junior officers straightened theirs. When he cleared his throat, conversation stopped mid-sentence. When he finally turned his attention to me, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Aria," he said, and the way he pronounced my name made it sound like an apology he was tired of making. "I think it's time we addressed the elephant in the room." Admiral Kellner shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with whatever was about to unfold. "Colonel Torn, perhaps we should—"
No, Admiral. Damien cut her off with the kind of polite authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. This needs to be said, for the good of the operation and the integrity of our intelligence community. He walked around the conference table slowly, deliberately, like a prosecutor approaching a witness he was about to destroy. Every step echoed in the silence, and I could feel 12 pairs of eyes tracking his movement while trying not to look directly at me. "My sister," he began, and the word sister came out like he was admitting to an embarrassing family secret, "has always been creative with the truth about her qualifications." The words hit me like physical blows. I felt my hands clench in my lap, nails digging into my palms hard enough to leave marks. "In college," Damien continued, stopping directly behind my chair so I couldn't see his face but could feel his presence looming over me, "she convinced her professors that she was conducting field research when she was actually backpacking through Asia on our parents' money. She turned a gap year of wandering around mountain villages into a thesis on undocumented linguistic variations." General Morrison, a man whose chest was covered with enough ribbons to outfit a parade, leaned forward with interest. "Are you suggesting her academic credentials are fraudulent, Colonel?" "Not fraudulent, just dramatically overstated. Aria has a talent for making hobby-level interests sound like professional expertise. She's been doing it since we were children."
I wanted to turn around and face him, but something about his positioning behind my chair made it clear that I wasn't supposed to move. I was supposed to sit there and take it, like I had during every family dinner when he'd explained to our parents why my latest academic achievement wasn't actually that impressive. For example, Damien's voice took on that tone of patient explanation he'd perfected over the years. The consultation contract she secured with the Department of Defense lists her as fluent in 12 Middle Eastern and Central Asian languages. That sounds impressive until you realize that her idea of fluency includes basic conversational ability and tourist-level vocabulary. Admiral Kellner's expression had shifted from uncomfortable to concerned. "Colonel, are you saying that Ms. Thorne has been misrepresenting her capabilities to the DoD?" "I'm saying," Damien replied, finally moving back into my line of sight, "that my sister has always been better at selling herself than at delivering results. And right now, with Operation Nightfall hanging in the balance, we can't afford to base our intelligence assessments on inflated resumes and wishful thinking." He clicked his laptop again, and a new document appeared on the wall screen. It was a contract. My contract with the Department of Defense, with certain lines highlighted in red. "According to this agreement," Damien read aloud, "Ms. Thorne is to provide expert linguistic analysis and real-time translation services for materials in Farsi, Dari, Pashto, Tajik, and related regional dialects. The problem is that the intercepted communications aren't in any of those languages." He paused, letting that statement settle over the room like a thick fog. "They're in a dialect called Wahi, a language spoken by fewer than 58,000 people worldwide, primarily in the remote Pamir Mountains. It's not related to Farsi. It's not related to any of the languages listed in her contract, and according to our linguistic databases, there are perhaps 12 scholars in the entire world who could provide reliable translation services for historical Wakhi texts, much less modern intelligence communications." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, could feel sweat forming along my hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning. "The question," Damien continued, his voice soft but carrying clearly through the room, "is whether we're going to continue pretending that wishful thinking and good intentions are adequate substitutes for actual expertise, or whether we're going to admit that this operation needs professional linguists, not well-meaning amateurs." General Morrison cleared his throat. "What exactly are you proposing, Colonel?" Damien straightened his shoulders, and I recognized the posture from our childhood.
It was the same stance he'd taken when explaining to our parents why I shouldn't be allowed to skip a grade, why I shouldn't be permitted to take advanced language classes, why my dreams of becoming a translator were unrealistic for someone with my limitations. "He proposing," he said, his eyes finally meeting mine for the first time since this nightmare had begun, "that my sister has always been better at selling herself than at delivering results. And right now, with Operation Nightfall hanging in the balance, we can't afford to base our intelligence assessments on inflated resumes and wishful thinking." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around the table, I could see officials nodding slowly, their expressions shifting from curiosity to resignation. They were buying it, every word. Because why wouldn't they? Damien was a decorated officer with 15 years of military experience. I was a civilian contractor in a thrift store blazer who'd apparently been caught inflating her qualifications. The math was simple, and it added up to my professional destruction. "Ms. Thorne," Admiral Kellner said, her voice not unkind, but carrying the weight of official judgment, "do you have any response to these allegations?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I explain that I had spent 3 years living in the Pamir Mountains, that I had learned Wakhi not from textbooks, but from elders who had invited me to share their fires and their stories, that the reason it wasn't on my official resume was because it had been personal, sacred, something I'd never imagined would become part of a government contract? How could I tell them that the document on Damien's screen wasn't just readable to me, it was familiar? That I recognized the handwriting style, the particular regional variations that marked it as coming from the Brog Hill Valley, that the person who had written those intercepted messages wasn't just using Wakhi, but using it in a way that suggested they were planning something that would make Operation Nightfall look like a minor inconvenience. I couldn't, because in that room, surrounded by uniforms and authority and my brother's perfectly constructed narrative, the truth sounded as impossible as everything else he'd accused me of fabricating. So I sat there, in my metal folding chair, watching my career disintegrate in real time, while the only person who was supposed to protect me stood behind a podium and explained to a room of strangers exactly why I had never been good enough. Just like he'd been doing our entire lives. Admiral Kellner's question hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon, and I could feel every person in that room waiting for my response. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter now, more hostile, casting sharp shadows that made everyone's faces look like carved from stone. I started, then stopped. My throat felt like I'd been swallowing sand for hours. "I can explain." "Actually," Damien interrupted, his voice cutting through mine like a blade through paper, "I think the evidence speaks for itself." He clicked his laptop again, and the wall screen filled with what looked like a detailed dossier. My dossier, apparently, complete with photographs I'd never seen before. "Over the past 18 months, he began, reading from his notes with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, Ms. Thorne has submitted 7 different translation assessments to various DoD departments. Each time, she's claimed expertise in languages that, upon closer examination, she has only superficial knowledge of." The screen changed to show a series of documents with red highlighting throughout. I recognized them immediately. Translation work I'd done for different military branches, projects I'd been proud of, languages I'd spent years learning. But seeing them displayed like this, with Damien's clinical annotations pointing out supposed errors and inconsistencies, they looked like evidence of fraud. "In March of last year," Damien continued, "she provided a translation of intercepted Taliban communications that our Afghan contacts later revealed contained several critical misinterpretations. The word meeting was translated as gathering, causing our analysts to categorize a strategic planning session as a social event." General Morrison leaned forward, his expression darkening. "What were the consequences of that misinterpretation?" A missed opportunity to prevent an attack on forward operating base Clearwater, Damien replied quietly. Fortunately, our ground intelligence caught wind of the actual plan through other channels, but if we had relied solely on Ms. Thorne's translation, he let the implications hang in the air. My hands were shaking now. I remembered that translation. I'd worked on it for 3 straight days, cross-referencing dialectical variations, consulting with academic sources, double-checking every phrase. The word in question could mean either meeting or gathering, depending on the regional context, and I'd made a judgment call based on the syntax structure. It had been a close call, a 50-50 decision in a language where context was everything. But Damien was presenting it as reckless incompetence. Then there's the incident from last September, he continued, advancing to the next slide. Miss Thorne claimed she could translate a series of documents recovered from a weapons cache in Syria. She assured the intelligence team that the materials were routine inventory lists. 3 weeks later, native Arabic speakers revealed that the documents actually contained detailed instructions for constructing improvised explosive devices. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. I could see the officials exchanging glances, their earlier discomfort transforming into something that looked dangerously like alarm. "Wait," I said, finding my voice at last. "That's not... Those documents were in a dialect I specifically flagged as uncertain. I recommended getting a second opinion." "After already providing what you called a preliminary but confident assessment," Damien cut me off smoothly, "an assessment that was used to classify the materials as low priority, which delayed proper analysis by 6 crucial days." He was twisting everything, taking my cautious, methodical approach to translation, the very thing that made me good at my job, and turning it into evidence of incompetence. Every hedge I included, every recommendation for additional verification, every careful qualification was being stripped away to make my work look careless and definitive when it had been anything but. "The pattern," Damien said, his voice taking on the tone of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis, "is consistent across all of Miss Thorne's work. Overconfidence in her abilities, inadequate cultural contexts, and a tendency to fill in gaps in her knowledge with educated guesses that turn out to be dangerously wrong." Captain Rodriguez, who'd been silent throughout the meeting, spoke up for the first time. "Colonel Thorne, are you saying that your sister has been deliberately misrepresenting her qualifications?" "Not deliberately," Damien replied, and there was something almost gentle in his voice now, a tone of regretful disappointment that was somehow worse than outright accusation. "I think Aria genuinely believes she's more qualified than she actually is. She's always been optimistic about her abilities. As children, she would convince our parents she understood things she'd only barely encountered. She'd read one book about a subject and present herself as an expert." The patronizing tone in his voice made my skin crawl. It was the same voice he'd used when explaining to our parents why I shouldn't be allowed to take the advanced placement exams, why I shouldn't apply to competitive universities, why my dreams of working in international relations were sweet but unrealistic. "The problem," he continued, "is that in our current situation, optimism isn't enough. We're dealing with intelligence that could affect the lives of American service members overseas. We can't afford to base our decisions on someone's enthusiastic but ultimately amateur interpretations of languages she's never formally studied." Admiral Kellner was making notes now, her pen moving across her legal pad with swift, decisive strokes. "What about her academic credentials, her thesis work?" Damien's smile was sharp and sad at the same time. Aria's thesis advisor at Westfield was Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, a literature professor, not a linguist. The thesis itself was accepted by the English department, not the linguistics program. It was treated as a cultural studies project, not a linguistic analysis. That wasn't true. It wasn't completely false either, which made it worse. Professor Hartwell had been my primary advisor, but I also worked extensively with Dr. Nazir Ahmad in the linguistics department and Dr. Sarah Chen in anthropology. My thesis had been interdisciplinary by design, drawing on literature, linguistics, and cultural anthropology, but the way Damien presented it made it sound like I'd somehow fooled the English department into accepting amateur work. Furthermore, Damien continued, clicking to another slide that showed my travel records, her so-called field research consisted of a 3-year backpacking trip funded by our parents. While I was serving my first deployment in Afghanistan, Aria was essentially on an extended vacation in the Hindu Kush, taking photographs and collecting stories from villagers who were probably telling her whatever a young American woman wanted to hear.
The casual dismissal of 3 of the most difficult, transformative years of my life hit me like a physical blow. 3 years of living in conditions that would have broken most people. 3 years of earning the trust of communities that had every reason to be suspicious of outsiders. 3 years of learning not just languages, but entire ways of thinking, of seeing the world through completely different cultural lenses. But in Damien's version, it was just an expensive gap-year adventure. The reality, he said, his voice growing more confident as he saw the effect his words were having on the room, is that we're facing a critical intelligence challenge that requires genuine expertise, not good intentions and tourist-level language skills. The walkie documents we intercepted aren't just random communications. Based on the metadata and transmission patterns, they appear to be coordinating something significant, possibly an attack that could compromise Operation Nightfall and endanger American personnel. General Morrison's expression had shifted from skeptical to genuinely concerned. What's your assessment of the immediate threat level? Unknown, Damien replied gravely. And that's exactly the problem. We're flying blind because we've been relying on inadequate translation services. Every hour we delay getting proper linguistic analysis increases the risk to our people in the field. The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the ventilation system. I could feel the weight of their judgment settling over me like a heavy blanket. In their eyes, I was no longer just an unqualified contractor. I was a liability, someone whose incompetence was actively endangering American lives. Ms. Thorne, Admiral Kellner said, her voice carefully neutral, given these allegations, I think it would be appropriate for you to step away from this project while we conduct a full review of your work and qualifications. The words hit me like a demolition charge. Step away. In government contracting language, that was code for, you're fired and we're going to make sure you never work in this field again. However, she continued, before we make any final decisions, is there anything you'd like to say in your defense? Any documentation or evidence that might address these concerns? I looked around the room at 12 faces that had already made up their minds. I could see it in their expressions. The polite distance of people who were trying to let me down gently, the administrative efficiency of officials who had more important problems to solve than my hurt feelings. And standing at the head of the table, my brother watched me with the same expression of patient disappointment he'd worn when I was 8 years old and had tried to convince our parents that I could read the Chinese characters on our takeout menus. The truth was sitting right there, on his laptop screen. Those walkie documents that had stumped the entire intelligence community. I could read them as easily as the morning newspaper. I knew not just what they said, but what they meant, what they revealed about the people who had written them and the plans they were making. But how could I prove that in a room where my own brother had just spent 20 minutes systematically destroying every piece of evidence that I'd ever been qualified for anything? How could I convince them that the scared-looking woman in the cheap blazer knew something that their entire intelligence apparatus had missed? I couldn't. So I sat there in my folding chair, surrounded by the wreckage of my professional reputation, and tried to figure out how to salvage something, anything, from the career that Damien had just methodically incinerated. What happened next wasn't just professional dismissal. It was something far more calculated, far more personal. Damien walked around the conference table slowly, deliberately, like a predator circling wounded prey. But instead of moving in for the kill,
He was savoring the moment, drawing it out for maximum psychological impact. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying that tone of false concern that I remembered from every childhood argument we'd ever had, "before Admiral Kellner makes any official decisions, I think there's something else this committee should see." My stomach dropped. There was more. He clicked his laptop again, and the wall screen filled with what looked like a personal email account. My personal email account. I could see messages in my inbox, conversations with friends, even a thread with my landlord about a leaky faucet. The casual invasion of privacy was so shocking that for a moment I couldn't even process what I was seeing. "How did you—" I started. Ms. Thorne's government-issued security clearance required a comprehensive background check. Part of that process involved examining her digital communications to ensure there were no security risks or conflicts of interest. That was a lie. A complete, bald-faced lie. I'd never been issued a government security clearance. My consulting contract was at a much lower classification level, requiring only a basic background check and a signed non-disclosure agreement. But the way he said it, with such casual authority, made it sound like established fact. "What we discovered," he continued, scrolling through my emails like he was reading a grocery list, "is a pattern of communication that raises serious questions about Miss Thorne's judgment and professional boundaries." He stopped at an email thread from 6 months ago and enlarged it on the screen. It was a conversation between me and Dr. Yusuf Nazari, a linguistics professor at the University of Tehran, who I'd met during an academic conference 3 years ago. We'd been discussing regional variations in Pameri languages, purely academic correspondence between scholars. "As you can see," Damien said, highlighting portions of the email exchange, "Miss Thorne has been sharing information about her government work with foreign nationals. In this particular exchange, she discusses interesting translation challenges and mentions working with military communications." The way he quoted my words, stripped of context and delivered in that clinical tone, made my innocent academic discussion sound like espionage. What I had actually written was a vague reference to finding my translation work intellectually stimulating, the kind of thing any professional might say about their job. But presented this way, to an audience primed to see me as a security risk, it looked damning. "Dr. Nazari," Damien continued, pulling up what appeared to be an intelligence brief, "is a person of interest to the CIA, not because he's suspected of any wrongdoing, but because of his connections to Iranian academic institutions that have historical ties to their intelligence services." General Morrison was leaning forward now, his expression grim. "Colonel, are you suggesting that Miss Thorne has been compromising classified information?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Damien replied, with the kind of careful precision that actually suggested everything. "I'm simply presenting the facts and allowing this committee to draw their own conclusions." He clicked to another email, this one from 8 months ago. It was a message I'd sent to my college roommate, Sarah, complaining about a particularly difficult translation project. In it, I jokingly referred to my work as trying to decode messages from people who apparently learned English from watching bad action movies. "Here," Damien said, highlighting that sentence, "we see Miss Thorne making light of classified communications, treating sensitive intelligence materials as if they were entertainment. She's sharing details about ongoing translation work with unauthorized individuals and demonstrating a cavalier attitude toward operational security." I wanted to scream. The email was obviously a private conversation with a friend, venting about work frustrations in the most general possible terms. I'd never mentioned specific documents, operations, or even which branch of the military I was working with. But in Damien's hands, my private correspondence became evidence of reckless endangerment of national security. "Furthermore," he said, scrolling to yet another email, "we have evidence of financial impropriety." The screen now showed a message between me and my accountant discussing how to properly report my consulting income and what business expenses I could legitimately deduct. It was the kind of mundane tax conversation that every independent contractor has with their accountant. As you can see, Damien explained, Miss Thorne has been categorizing personal travel expenses as business deductions, claiming that her cultural research trips are work-related when they're actually recreational activities funded by taxpayer money. That was the final straw. The emails were invasive enough, but this was a deliberate misrepresentation of basic business accounting. I'd claimed legitimate research expenses, conference attendance, academic materials, language learning software, not personal vacations. That's not true, I said, finally finding my voice. Those were legitimate professional expenses. I have documentation. Miss Thorne, Admiral Kellner interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of official authority. I think it would be best if you remained silent while we complete this review. The words hit me like a physical slap. I wasn't just being accused of professional incompetence anymore. I was being treated like a criminal suspect, told to remain silent while evidence was presented against me. The polite veneer of bureaucratic procedure was still there, but underneath, it was something much darker. Damien wasn't finished. He pulled up another screen, this one showing my social media accounts. Pictures of me from my travels, images of mountain villages, photos of me learning traditional crafts from local artisans. Innocent documentation of genuine cultural exchange. But presented this way, they looked like evidence of something sinister. What's particularly concerning, he said, zooming in on a photo of me sharing tea with an elderly walkie speaker in the Pamir Mountains, is the extent to which Miss Thorne has cultivated relationships with individuals in regions that are now considered strategically sensitive. He clicked through more photos, each one accompanied by his commentary. Me learning traditional weaving techniques became establishing connections with local infrastructure. Me participating in a village festival became integrating into community power structures. Me sitting with elders and learning their language became developing intimate access to regional intelligence networks. The question is, he said, turning to face the committee with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of military bearing, whether these relationships represent genuine academic interest or something more calculated. Captain Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Colonel, are you suggesting that your sister is some kind of asset for a foreign intelligence service? I'm not implying anything, Damien repeated, using the same careful language that allowed him to make accusations while maintaining plausible deniability. I'm simply presenting the facts and allowing this committee to draw their own conclusions. However, he continued, his voice softening slightly, I don't believe Miss Thorne is acting with malicious intent. I think she's simply over her head, making poor decisions because she doesn't understand the gravity of the work she's been asked to do. And there it was, the final twist of the knife. Not content to destroy my professional reputation, he was now positioning himself as the concerned brother, reluctantly protecting national security from his well-meaning but dangerously naive sister. Which is why, he concluded, I believe the appropriate action is immediate termination of her contract, revocation of any access to classified materials, and a recommendation that she be barred from future government consulting work pending a full security review.
The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around the table, I could see officials nodding in agreement, their expressions shifting from concern to resignation. They weren't just firing me. They were ensuring that I would never work in this field again. Admiral Kellner was making more notes, her pen moving across her legal pad with swift, decisive strokes. Miss Thorne, she said without looking up, you'll need to surrender any materials related to your government work immediately. Security personnel will escort you from the building and conduct a full inventory of any documents or devices in your possession. Security personnel. Escort from the building.
The language of criminal investigation applied to someone whose only crime was being related to a man who had turned ambition into a weapon. I looked across the table at my brother, standing there in his perfectly pressed uniform with his perfectly constructed case, and realized that this had never been about national security or professional competence. This had been about power, about control, about settling a score that had been building since we were children, and I had first dared to dream of being something other than his lesser shadow. The worst part was the expression on his face. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just that same look of patient disappointment he'd worn when explaining to our parents why I wasn't ready for advanced classes, why I wasn't mature enough for certain privileges, why my dreams were unrealistic and needed to be adjusted downward for my own good. He was destroying my career not with anger, but with the quiet efficiency of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary task, like putting down a sick animal. Humanely, but definitively. The silence that followed Admiral Kellner's pronouncement wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that fills a room when everyone present realizes they're witnessing someone's professional execution and nobody wants to be the one to speak first. I looked around the table, searching for even a flicker of doubt, a single questioning expression. Someone who might think that maybe, just maybe, this whole thing was moving too fast. What I found instead was a room full of people studiously avoiding eye contact, each one finding something fascinating about their notepads, their coffee cups, the grain pattern in the mahogany table. General Morrison cleared his throat softly, the sound unnaturally loud in the heavy stillness. "Admiral, I think we should proceed with the security protocols immediately. The sooner we can contain any potential breach, the better." Contain. The word hit me like ice water. I wasn't a person with concerns that needed to be addressed, or a professional whose work needed to be reviewed. I was a security breach that needed to be contained. Captain Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "I'll coordinate with base security to ensure proper escort procedures. We'll need to inventory all materials and devices, conduct a full digital forensic sweep of her personal electronics." They were talking about me like I wasn't sitting right there, like I was already gone, already reduced to a problem that needed to be cleaned up efficiently and quietly. The casual dehumanization of it was almost worse than the accusations themselves. "What about media management?" asked Colonel Patricia Hayes, a communications officer whose job was apparently to figure out how to spin my destruction into something that wouldn't embarrass the Department of Defense. "If word of this gets out, we'll need a coordinated response strategy." Admiral Kellner nodded thoughtfully. "Draft a statement emphasizing that this is routine personnel review, standard security protocols. No mention of specific allegations or family relationships." Family relationships. Even now, they were protecting Damien's reputation while arranging the dismantling of mine. They would frame this as a neutral administrative decision, just a civilian contractor whose services were no longer required. No one would ever know that I had been systematically destroyed by my own brother in front of a room full of people who had the power to stop it and chose not to. "Ma'am," said Major Thompson, a young officer who'd been silent throughout the entire proceedings, "should we notify the other departments that have used Miss Thorne's services? There may be additional materials that need to be secured." Additional materials. More of my work to be scrutinized, reinterpreted, twisted into evidence of incompetence or security violations. I thought about the projects I'd completed over the past 2 years, the translations I'd been proud of, the careful analyses I'd provided to help people make informed decisions. All of it would now be reviewed through the lens of Damien's narrative. All of it tainted by association with the contractor who turned out to be a liability. "Yes," Admiral Kellner replied quietly. "Full interdepartmental review. We need to assess potential damage from any previous work that may have been compromised by inadequate translation services." The clinical language they were using made my skin crawl. I wasn't a person who'd made some mistakes, or even someone who'd been unfairly accused. I was damage to be assessed, contamination to be cleaned up, a problem that had unfortunately infiltrated their system and now needed to be surgically removed. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a civilian analyst who'd been brought in to review linguistic protocols, spoke up for the first time. I have some concerns about the precedent we're setting here. Ms. Thorne's academic credentials, while perhaps not perfectly aligned with current needs, aren't entirely without merit. Perhaps a more graduated response. Dr. Warren, Damien interrupted smoothly, I appreciate your academic perspective, but we're not in a university setting here. We're dealing with active intelligence that affects the safety of American personnel overseas. Academic merit doesn't outweigh operational security.
Furthermore, Damien continued, seizing on the moment of doubt to reinforce his position, every day we spend debating academic qualifications is another day that Operation Nightfall operates with compromised intelligence. We can't afford to let sentimentality override security protocols. The word sentimentality landed like a slap. He was suggesting that any defense of me, any question about the rush to judgment, was just emotional weakness interfering with hard military logic. It was a masterful rhetorical move that made questioning his narrative seem unprofessional, almost unpatriotic. I watched Dr. Warren's face as she absorbed the rebuke, saw her expression shift from concern to resignation. She wasn't going to push back any further. None of them were. Because Damien had framed this perfectly. Defending me meant opposing national security, and nobody in that room was willing to be cast in that role. Colonel Hayes was already typing on her tablet, probably drafting the press statement that would reduce my professional death to a few bland sentences about personnel adjustments and routine security reviews. Major Thompson was making notes about which departments to contact for the interdepartmental review that would systematically destroy every piece of work I'd ever done for the government. There is one more thing, Damien said, his voice taking on a tone of reluctant duty. Given the extent of Ms. Thorne's foreign contacts and the sensitive nature of the materials she's had access to, I recommend that we flag her passport for monitoring. Nothing invasive, just standard precautionary measures to ensure that she doesn't inadvertently compromise ongoing operations. Passport monitoring. They were talking about putting me on a watch list, treating me like a potential flight risk or foreign intelligence asset. The casual destruction of my civil liberties was being discussed like a routine administrative task, just another box to check in the process of neutralizing a security threat. Agreed, Admiral Kellner said, without looking up from her notes. I'll coordinate with State Department security to implement appropriate monitoring protocols. The efficiency of it was breathtaking. In less than an hour, Damien had orchestrated not just the end of my career, but the systematic dismantling of my life. My professional reputation destroyed, my personal communications invaded, my travel restricted, my future employment prospects in my chosen field eliminated. And he'd done it all while positioned as the reluctant patriot, forced to take action against his own sister for the good of the country. I realized that nobody in that room was going to ask me a single question. They weren't interested in my side of the story, my explanations, my evidence. The decision had already been made, probably before I'd even entered the room. This wasn't a hearing or a review. It was a formality, a procedural requirement before implementing a predetermined outcome. Security will be here in 5 minutes, Admiral Kellner announced, checking her watch. Miss Thorne, you'll be escorted to a secure room where you can gather any personal items from your workspace. All electronic devices will need to be surrendered for forensic analysis. You'll receive them back once the security review is complete. Once the security review is complete. A review that would be conducted by people who'd already been told I was a security risk, who'd be looking for evidence to confirm what they had already decided. My devices would be returned to me eventually, probably wiped clean and accompanied by a legal document requiring me to never discuss what happened in this room.
"Is there anything you'd like to say before security arrives?" Admiral Kellner asked, her tone suggesting that this was a courtesy she was extending out of procedural completeness rather than genuine interest in my response. I looked around the table one more time, at the faces that had already written me off, at the officials who'd allowed themselves to be convinced that I was everything Damien had painted me to be. Then I looked at my brother, standing at the head of the room with his perfect posture and his perfectly crafted narrative, waiting to see if I would try to defend myself, or if I would accept my fate with dignity. "No," I said quietly. "I have nothing to say." Because what was the point? In a room where the truth had been predetermined, where my own brother had spent months preparing a case designed to destroy me, where 12 military officials had decided that efficiency was more important than accuracy, what possible combination of words could change anything? The soft knock on the conference room door came exactly 5 minutes later, just as Admiral Kellner had promised. 2 security officers in crisp uniforms entered, their faces professionally neutral, their movements efficient and practiced. They'd done this before, escorted disgraced contractors out of secure facilities, supervised the collection of personal items from people whose careers had just ended, managed the quiet removal of problems that needed to disappear. As I stood to leave, Damien finally looked directly at me for what I knew would be the last time. His expression wasn't triumphant or satisfied. It was the same look of patient disappointment he'd worn throughout our childhood. The expression that said he was sorry things had to be this way, but some people just weren't capable of meeting the standards that mattered. And in that moment, I realized that this had never been about national security or operational competence or any of the professional concerns he'd raised. This had been about proving once and for all that he had been right about me all along.
The security escort through the Pentagon corridors felt like a death march, but it also gave me time to think. As my heels clicked against the polished floor, flanked by 2 officers whose job was to ensure I didn't steal state secrets on my way out, I found myself remembering the last time Damien had systematically dismantled something I cared about. I was 12 years old, and it was the night before the regional spelling bee. I'd been preparing for months, memorizing etymology patterns and language roots, with the same obsessive focus that would later drive me to learn Wakhi and Dari and a dozen other languages most Americans couldn't even pronounce. The spelling bee wasn't just a competition for me. It was proof that my weird fascination with words and sounds and the way different languages fit together in my mind actually meant something. Damien was 16 then, captain of the varsity football team, student body president, the kind of teenager who collected achievements like Pokemon cards. Our parents adored him with the uncomplicated pride that comes from having a child who excels at things everyone understands and values. Football stats, leadership positions, honor roll grades. These were accomplishments that translated easily into dinner party conversations and Christmas card updates. My linguistic obsessions, on the other hand, were treated like an embarrassing hobby that I'd hopefully outgrow once I discovered more normal teenage interests. The night before the spelling bee, I was in my room practicing with flashcards when Damien knocked on my door. He came in carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate, a peace offering that should have made me suspicious, but instead made me ridiculously happy. He so rarely sought out my company back then, always too busy with his important teenage business to spend time with his weird little sister. "So tomorrow's the big day," he said, settling onto my bed like he had all the time in the world. "You ready for this?" I launched into an excited explanation of my preparation strategy, how I'd been studying word origins and linguistic patterns, how I'd figured out that if you understood the root languages, you could often work out spellings even for words you'd never seen before. It was the kind of nerdy enthusiasm that I usually kept to myself, but Damien was listening with what seemed like genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and nodding at the right moments. "That's really smart," he said when I finished. "You've always been good at seeing patterns that other people miss. It's like a superpower." I practically glowed at the praise. Damien calling something I did a superpower was better than winning the spelling bee itself. "But," he continued, and that single word should have been my warning,
I've been thinking about whether this is really the best use of your time. He explained, with the patient logic that he'd inherited from our father the surgeon, that spending so much energy on spelling bees and language games was probably limiting my social development. Wouldn't I rather join the drama club, or try out for junior varsity soccer, or do something that would help me make friends and develop normal teenage skills? The thing is, Aria, he used the same gentle tone that our parents used when explaining why I couldn't have a puppy, you're never going to make a career out of knowing how to spell obscure words. But if you don't learn how to connect with people your own age, you're going to have problems later. He painted a picture of my future that was both devastating and plausible, socially awkward, professionally isolated, brilliant in irrelevant ways, but unable to succeed in the real world because I'd spent too much time developing skills that didn't matter to anyone else. He never saying you should quit, he clarified. I'm just saying maybe after tomorrow, you might want to think about branching out, developing some interests that will actually help you when you're older. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, his words echoing in my mind. By morning, I'd convinced myself that he was right, that my linguistic obsessions were a dead-end path that was keeping me from developing into the kind of person who could actually succeed in life. I lost the spelling bee in the third round, choking on a word I'd known perfectly the night before. But instead of being disappointed, I felt almost relieved. This was the universe telling me that Damien was right, that it was time to focus on more practical things. I never entered another language competition. I quit the Latin club, stopped spending weekends at the library researching etymology, tried to develop interests in things that seemed more socially acceptable. And for a while, it seemed to work. I made more friends, got invited to more parties, started dating a boy from my chemistry class who thought my linguistic abilities were cute, but not particularly impressive. But the passion never really went away. It just went underground. In college, while Damien was pursuing a pre-law track that would eventually lead to his military officer program, I found myself drifting toward the linguistics department, despite my official English major. I told myself I was just taking a few classes for fun, just satisfying curiosity, not really committing to anything that might be seen as impractical or antisocial. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell became my lifeline during those years, the first adult who'd ever looked at my linguistic abilities and seen something valuable rather than something that needed to be managed or redirected. When she suggested that I might want to consider graduate work in applied linguistics, I was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. But when I mentioned it to Damien during one of our weekly phone calls, his response was immediate and decisive.
"Aria, come on," he said, and I could practically hear him shaking his head through the phone. "You're smarter than that. What are you going to do with a linguistics degree? Teach high school Spanish? Work at the United Nations translating for diplomats who make 10 times more money than you ever will?" He had a point, or at least it seemed like he did. The practical career applications for advanced linguistic study weren't exactly obvious, especially compared to Damien's clear path from college to law school, to military service, to eventual political career. "Look," he said, softening his tone the way he always did when he was about to deliver what he considered helpful advice. "I know you love languages. It's great that you have interests outside the mainstream. But you also need to think about your future realistically. What kind of life do you want to have? What kind of security do you want to build for yourself?" The conversation lasted 2 hours, and by the end of it, I'd been convinced that pursuing linguistics seriously was a form of self-sabotage, a way of avoiding the hard work of building a real career in favor of indulging in academic fantasies that would leave me financially unstable and professionally irrelevant. So I compromised. I finished my English degree, got a job at a marketing firm, and told myself that I was being practical and mature. I could always study languages as a hobby, right? I could travel, maybe take some evening classes, keep the interest alive without making it the center of my life. The marketing job lasted 18 months before I realized I was dying inside. Every day spent writing copy for products I didn't care about, attending meetings about campaigns that felt meaningless,
pretending to be excited about strategies for manipulating consumer behavior. It was like being slowly suffocated by the weight of other people's expectations. That's when I made the decision that would eventually lead me to that Pentagon briefing room. I quit the marketing job, applied for a teaching English abroad program, and told my family I was taking a gap year to find myself before settling into a more serious career. Damien's response was predictable. Concerned disappointment mixed with barely concealed frustration that his little sister was once again choosing the impractical path instead of the sensible one. "You're 22 years old," he said during the family dinner where I announced my plans. "At some point, you need to stop running away from adult responsibilities." Our parents nodded in agreement, their faces showing the same mixture of love and exasperation that had characterized the reaction to most of my major life decisions. They would support me, they always did, but they also clearly hoped that this phase would pass quickly and I would eventually settle into something more conventional. What none of them understood, what I was only beginning to understand myself, was that languages weren't just a hobby for me. They were a way of thinking, a method of understanding how human beings create meaning and connection across cultural boundaries. Every new language I learned wasn't just a new skill set, it was a new lens through which to see the world. The 3 years I spent in Central Asia, living in villages where electricity was sporadic and internet was non-existent, learning languages that most Americans had never heard of, those weren't gap years or extended vacation time. They were the most intensive education I'd ever received, an apprenticeship in cultural translation that no university program could have provided. But I never figured out how to explain that to my family in ways that sounded like legitimate professional development rather than expensive wandering. So, when I came back with my stories and my linguistic abilities and my deep understanding of regional politics and cultural dynamics, Damien heard hobby skills, where I heard specialized expertise. And now, walking through Pentagon corridors with a security escort, I realized that the pattern hadn't changed. Damien was still the practical older brother, protecting me from my own impractical choices, steering me toward more sensible options for my own good. The only difference was that this time, his version of protective guidance involved destroying my career in front of a room of people who had the power to ensure I never worked in my field again. As we reached the exit, one of the security officers handed me a receipt for my confiscated materials and a business card for the legal office that would handle my security review. "Standard procedure," he explained. "Nothing personal." Nothing personal. That was the most devastating part of all of this. To everyone else in that building, I was just another security risk that had been efficiently neutralized. But to Damien, I was the little sister who'd never learned to make practical choices, and he was still trying to save me from myself. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat in my studio apartment that evening, surrounded by the remnants of a career that had just been incinerated. While Damien had spent the last 15 years climbing a ladder that everyone could see and understand, West Point, Ranger School, multiple deployments, staff positions, promotions that came with ceremonies and newspaper announcements, I had been building something invisible. After I left Central Asia, I didn't come home and immediately start working for the Department of Defense. The path that led me to that Pentagon briefing room was far more circuitous, far more accidental than Damien's carefully plotted military ascent. I spent my first year back in the States feeling completely displaced, like an anthropologist returning from a distant planet. The mundane concerns of American life, like traffic jams, coffee preferences, the endless debate about streaming service subscriptions, felt surreal after 3 years of living in places where the primary concerns were clean water and whether the mountain passes would be open for supply deliveries.
I crashed on friends' couches, picked up freelance translation work through online platforms, and slowly began to realize that my linguistic abilities weren't just academic curiosities. They were increasingly valuable professional skills in a world where global communication was becoming more complex, not simpler. My first real government contract came through pure chance. Dr. Sarah Mendez, a professor I'd met at a linguistics conference, forwarded me an email from a Department of State contractor who needed someone to review translations of Central Asian news broadcasts.
The regular translator had fallen ill, and they needed someone who could work quickly and accurately with Tajik and Dari documents. It was supposed to be a 2-week temporary assignment. I completed it in 4 days, providing not just translations, but cultural context that explained why certain phrases carried political implications that weren't obvious to American analysts. The cultural notes I added turned routine news summaries into intelligence assessments that helped State Department officials understand the political dynamics behind seemingly mundane regional coverage. Dr. Mendez forwarded my work to a contact at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Within a month, I had 3 more contracts. Within 6 months, I was working regularly with 4 different government agencies providing translation and cultural analysis services that nobody else seemed able to deliver with the same level of nuanced understanding. But here's what made my path fundamentally different from Damien's. I never tried to build a public profile. I never networked at military social events or sought out opportunities to brief senior officials. I just did the work, submitted my reports, and moved on to the next project. While Damien was attending command and staff college, building relationships with future generals, and positioning himself for high-visibility assignments, I was sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m., cross-referencing dialect variations in intercepted radio transmissions with historical migration patterns to help analysts understand whether certain communications represented new threats or routine administrative chatter. The invisibility was intentional. The communities I'd lived with in Central Asia had taught me that the most valuable knowledge is often the most quietly held. In Pamiri culture, the people with the deepest understanding of regional politics and social dynamics are rarely the ones who speak loudest in village councils. They're the ones who listen carefully, who understand the subtleties of what isn't being said, who can translate not just words, but the complex web of cultural meaning that surrounds those words. I brought that approach to my government work. I never oversold my capabilities or promised more than I could deliver. I provided careful, thorough analysis that acknowledged uncertainty where it existed and flagged areas where additional research might be valuable. I built a reputation for reliability and accuracy, but it was a quiet reputation, known primarily to the analysts and project managers who worked directly with my translations. Damien's career, meanwhile, was everything mine wasn't: public, celebrated, easy to understand. His promotion ceremonies made local newspapers. His deployment photos appeared on our parents' Facebook pages. His military achievements were the kind that translated easily into civilian conversation. Everyone understood what it meant to be a lieutenant colonel, even if they didn't fully grasp the responsibilities that came with the rank. The divergence in our approaches became clear during one of our family Christmas gatherings, about 2 years before the Pentagon incident. Damien had just returned from a deployment to Afghanistan, and he spent most of Christmas Eve dinner regaling our parents and extended family with stories from his tour as a battalion operations officer. "The thing people don't realize," he said, gesturing with his wine glass in a way that commanded attention from everyone at the table, "is that modern military operations are fundamentally about information management. It's not just about having better equipment or training. It's about understanding the cultural and political context well enough to make the right strategic decisions." Our father nodded approvingly. "That's the kind of thinking that's going to serve you well as you move up in rank, understanding the bigger picture, not just the tactical details." When attention inevitably turned to me, I mentioned that I'd been doing some consulting work for various government agencies, helping with language and cultural analysis projects. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," our mother said, her tone carrying that particular note of pride mixed with gentle concern that I'd come to recognize as her default response to my professional updates. "Are you enjoying the work?" Before I could respond, Damien jumped in with what he probably thought was helpful context. "Aria's been doing some really interesting translation work. A lot of academic-level cultural research working with some pretty obscure languages. It's the kind of specialized knowledge that can be really valuable in the right context." The phrase academic level was pure Damien. Technically accurate, but subtly diminishing, suggesting that my work was theoretical rather than practical, scholarly rather than operationally significant. The challenge, he continued, and I felt my stomach tighten because I knew what was coming, is that government consulting can be pretty unpredictable. Contracts come and go, and you're always at the mercy of budget cycles and changing priorities. It's not like having a steady position with clear advancement opportunities. Our Uncle Mark, a successful corporate lawyer, nodded sagely. That's the trade-off with consulting work. You get variety and independence, but you sacrifice security and career trajectory.
What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my academic-level cultural research had contributed to intelligence assessments that influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of government. My work with obscure languages had helped prevent diplomatic incidents and identify security threats that would have been missed entirely if analysts had relied on conventional translation services. The walkie documents that would eventually become the center of the Pentagon crisis were actually the third set of materials I'd encountered in that language over the previous 18 months. The first two had been routine intelligence intercepts, communications between tribal leaders discussing water rights and grazing permissions. But even in those mundane conversations, I'd noticed linguistic patterns that suggested the speakers were using formal, ceremonial language in contexts where casual conversation would have been more appropriate. It was a subtle indication that the communications might have deeper significance than their surface content suggested, the kind of cultural nuance that would be invisible to translators who understood walkie vocabulary but not the social contexts in which different linguistic registers were employed. I'd flagged those patterns in my reports, suggesting that future intercepts in the same dialect might warrant additional analysis. But because my observations were presented as cultural context rather than intelligence assessments, they were filed away as interesting background information rather than actionable intelligence. That was the fundamental difference between Damien's career and mine. He operated in a world where value was measured by visibility, where advancement came through recognition and relationships and the ability to articulate your contributions in ways that impressed senior officials. I operated in a world where value was measured by accuracy, where the best work was often the most invisible, where success meant providing insights that helped other people make better decisions, even if those people never knew my name. Both approaches had merit. Military organizations need leaders like Damien, officers who can build consensus, communicate effectively with diverse audiences, and translate complex operational requirements into clear guidance for subordinate units. But they also need people like me, specialists who can provide deep, nuanced analysis of information that doesn't fit neatly into conventional categories. The tragedy was that Damien had never understood that our different approaches could be complementary rather than competitive. In his mind, my invisible expertise was inherently less valuable than his visible leadership, my cultural analysis inherently less important than his operational experience. And now, sitting in my apartment with my government contracts terminated and my professional reputation in ruins, I realized that invisibility, for all its intellectual integrity, was a terrible defense against someone who understood exactly how to destroy what couldn't be easily seen or explained. 3 days after my professional execution at the Pentagon, I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at a stack of bills I could no longer afford to pay, when my secure phone rang. I hadn't heard that particular ringtone in 6 months, and for a moment I wondered if it was some kind of cruel joke, the government calling to ask for one last translation while simultaneously destroying my ability to ever work for them again. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Marcus Webb, Deputy Director of the National Security Agency's Linguistic Analysis Division, a man I'd never met in person, but whose requests for urgent translation work had interrupted my sleep more times than I could count over the past 2 years. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that suggested he was calling from a secure location and didn't have much time. "I need you to understand something. What happened to you at that Pentagon briefing was not authorized by my office, and it was not based on any performance issues we've identified in your work." I set down my coffee cup, my hands suddenly unsteady. "Dr. Webb, I don't think I'm supposed to be talking to you right now. My contract was terminated, and there's a security review."
The security review is bullshit, he interrupted, his professional composure cracking slightly. And your contract termination was engineered by someone who either doesn't understand what you actually do for us or understands it perfectly and sees it as a threat. He paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background, the sound of someone dealing with documents that probably carried classification levels I wasn't cleared to know about. Miss Thorne, do you know what Project Babel is? I didn't, and told him so. Project Babel is a classified NSA initiative to identify and recruit linguistic specialists who can provide analysis of communications in languages or dialects that fall outside our standard intelligence collection capabilities. Over the past 3 years, you've been our primary contractor for materials in 12 different Central Asian languages and dialects. 12 languages. I started counting in my head. Waki, Shugni, Rushani, Bartungi, Yazguyam, Ishkashimi, but Dr. Webb continued before I could finish my mental inventory. What makes your work uniquely valuable isn't just that you can translate these languages, it's that you understand the cultural and political context well enough to provide the kind of analysis that helps us distinguish between routine communications and potential intelligence indicators. You don't just tell us what people are saying, you tell us what they mean and why it matters. I thought about the hundreds of documents I'd translated over the past 2 years, the careful cultural notes I'd included with every submission, the way I'd learned to flag linguistic patterns that might indicate deception, coordination, or hidden meaning. For example, Dr. Webb continued, last August, you translated a series of radio intercepts from the Afghanistan-Tajik border region. Standard translation would have categorized them as routine tribal communications about livestock and trade routes. But you identified subtle linguistic markers that suggested the speakers were using coded language to coordinate movement of people and materials across international boundaries. I remembered those intercepts. The speakers had been using formal register Waki in contexts where casual conversation would have been appropriate, and they'd employed certain metaphorical constructions that were traditionally associated with ceremonial or religious discourse. It was like listening to people discuss grocery shopping in the language reserved for wedding ceremonies. Technically coherent, but culturally nonsensical unless something else was going on. Based on your analysis, Dr. Webb said, we were able to coordinate with border security agencies to intercept what turned out to be a significant smuggling operation that was moving both contraband and personnel across multiple Central Asian borders. That operation led to the identification of networks that we're still mapping, connections that have provided valuable intelligence about regional security threats. I had never been told about the results of my translations. I submitted my reports through secure channels and never heard back unless there were follow-up questions or requests for additional context. I'd assumed my work was being filed away as background information, used primarily to help analysts understand regional context rather than to support active operations. Dr. Webb, I said slowly, if my work was valuable enough that NSA was using it for active operations, why wasn't that mentioned during the briefing? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Dr. Webb finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured, like someone choosing his words for an audience beyond our conversation. Miss Thorne, Project Babel operates under a different classification structure than standard DoD translation contracts. The work you've been doing for us has been compartmentalized for security reasons. Your brother's office wouldn't have had access to our operational files or our assessment of your work. Compartmentalized. That was government speak for, your brother destroyed your career based on incomplete information because he didn't have the clearance level necessary to understand what you actually do. However, Dr. Webb continued, the timing of your contract termination, combined with certain other developments we've been tracking, suggests that someone may have deliberately ensured that your brother didn't have access to complete information about your work and qualifications. Someone. The word hung in the air like a loaded weapon. What kind of other developments? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Miss Thorne, I'm going to tell you something that you cannot discuss with anyone outside of secure channels. 3 days before your Pentagon briefing, we intercepted communications suggesting that hostile intelligence services have been attempting to identify and neutralize American linguistic assets who specialize in Central Asian languages and dialects. The coffee mug slipped from my hands, shattering on the kitchen floor and sending ceramic fragments across the tiles. The appearance appears to be specifically targeting contractors and analysts who have deep cultural knowledge of the regions where these languages are spoken. The goal seems to be disrupting our intelligence collection capabilities by eliminating our ability to accurately interpret communications in languages that fall outside standard diplomatic and military channels. I was having trouble processing what he was telling me. Are you saying that someone deliberately fed my brother information designed to get me fired? I'm saying that the information your brother presented at that briefing was remarkably comprehensive and strategically targeted. Someone had done extensive research into your work, your travel history, your academic background, and your personal communications. They knew exactly which aspects of your background could be presented in ways that would raise security concerns, and they knew exactly how to frame those concerns to maximize their impact on a Pentagon review panel. Dr. Webb, I said slowly, if my work was valuable enough that NSA was using it for active operations, why wasn't that mentioned during the briefing? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Dr. Webb finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured, like someone choosing his words for an audience beyond our conversation. Miss Thorne, Project Babel operates under a different classification structure than standard DoD translation contracts. The work you've been doing for us has been compartmentalized for security reasons. Your brother's office wouldn't have had access to our operational files or our assessment of your work. Compartmentalized. That was government speak for your brother destroyed your career based on incomplete information because he didn't have the clearance level necessary to understand what you actually do. However, Dr. Webb continued, the timing of your contract termination, combined with certain other developments we've been tracking, suggests that someone may have deliberately ensured that your brother didn't have access to complete information about your work and qualifications. Someone. The word hung in the air like a loaded weapon. What kind of other developments? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Miss Thorne, I'm going to tell you something that you cannot discuss with anyone outside of secure channels. 3 days before your Pentagon briefing, we intercepted communications suggesting that hostile intelligence services have been attempting to identify and neutralize American linguistic assets who specialize in Central Asian languages and dialects. The operation appears to be specifically targeting contractors and analysts who have deep cultural knowledge of the regions where these languages are spoken. The goal seems to be disrupting our intelligence collection capabilities by eliminating our ability to accurately interpret communications in languages that fall outside standard diplomatic and military channels. I was having trouble processing what he was telling me. Are you saying that someone deliberately fed my brother information designed to get me fired? I'm saying that the information your brother presented at that briefing was remarkably comprehensive and strategically targeted. Someone had done extensive research into your work, your travel history, your academic background, and your personal communications. They knew exactly which aspects of your background could be presented in ways that would raise security concerns, and they knew exactly how to frame those concerns to maximize their impact on a Pentagon review panel. He paused again, and I could hear him typing in the background. Furthermore, he continued, the person who provided that information to your brother would have needed access to classified databases that should have been well above his clearance level. The fact that he was able to present detailed analysis of your foreign contacts, your travel patterns, and your communication records suggests that someone with significant intelligence access was feeding him information. The kitchen felt like it was spinning around me. I sat down hard in one of my chairs, trying to make sense of what Dr. Webb was telling me. Dr. Webb, are you saying that my brother was manipulated into destroying my career as part of some kind of foreign intelligence operation? I'm saying that your brother appears to have been provided with carefully curated information by someone who understood exactly how that information would be interpreted and what actions it would trigger. Whether he was a willing participant or an unwitting asset is something that other people are going to have to determine. Other people. More government acronyms, more classified investigations, more layers of bureaucracy that I would never see or understand.
But here's what I can tell you, Dr. Webb said, his voice taking on a note of finality. Your work for Project Babel has been critical to several ongoing operations that affect national security. You have been providing analysis that no one else in our contractor network can provide. And if certain people are going to significant lengths to neutralize your capabilities, that suggests your work is more valuable and more threatening to hostile interests than even we realized. As I hung up the phone, I realized that everything I thought I understood about the Pentagon briefing had been wrong. It wasn't just family dynamics or professional jealousy or Damien's need to protect his reputation by sacrificing mine. It was warfare, and I had been the target. The call came at 3:47 a.m., 6 days after Dr. Webb had turned my understanding of everything upside down. I recognized the number immediately, Pentagon main switchboard, and I answered on the first ring because you don't ignore calls from the Department of Defense at 3:47 in the morning, even when they've recently destroyed your career. Miss Thorne, the voice was crisp, efficient, belonging to someone who was accustomed to delivering urgent information to people who weren't fully awake. This is Colonel Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Communications Division. I need you to report to the Pentagon immediately for an emergency briefing. A car will be at your location in 20 minutes. I was still processing the fact that they were summoning me back to the building where I'd been professionally executed less than a week earlier, when Colonel Hayes continued. Ma'am, you should know that this is being classified as a national security emergency. The briefing you'll be attending is at the highest classification levels. 22 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of an unmarked government sedan, wearing the same blazer I'd worn to my destruction, trying to understand why the Pentagon would want me back when they'd made it clear that my services were not just unwanted, but potentially dangerous to national security. The Pentagon at 4:30 a.m. was a different building entirely. Gone were the bustling corridors filled with officials carrying important folders and having important conversations. Instead, the hallways were nearly empty, patrolled by security personnel who checked my credentials 3 separate times before escorting me to an elevator that required a key card I'd never seen before. The briefing room was smaller than the one where Damien had orchestrated my downfall, but the atmosphere was infinitely more intense. Instead of 12 officials seated around a polished conference table, there were perhaps 20 people clustered around workstations covered with computer monitors, satellite phones, and stacks of documents marked with classification levels that made my eyes water. At the center of it all stood General Patricia Morrison, the same woman who'd nodded approvingly while Damien systematically dismantled my reputation. But now her expression was grim, focused, carrying the weight of someone dealing with a crisis that was unfolding in real time. Miss Thorne, she said as I entered, her voice cutting through the low buzz of urgent conversations. Thank you for coming. We have a situation. She gestured to a wall-mounted display showing what appeared to be a map of Central Asia with various colored indicators scattered across the terrain. Approximately 6 hours ago, we lost contact with a joint intelligence gathering operation along the Afghan-Tajik border. The last communication we received was a burst transmission in Walkie, followed by complete radio silence. My stomach clenched as I realized why I'd been summoned back to the building where I'd been declared a security risk. Our standard translation services, General Morrison continued, her voice taking on a note of barely controlled frustration, have been unable to provide coherent interpretation of the transmission. The syntax doesn't match any known Walkie variants in our linguistic databases, and the vocabulary contains elements that our translators are categorizing as either coded language or dialect variations they can't identify. She turned to look directly at me,
and I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen during the previous briefing. Respect, tinged with what might have been embarrassment. Miss Thorne, I'm going to be frank with you. 6 days ago, this committee made a decision based on information that we now have reason to believe was incomplete and potentially manipulated. We terminated your contract and initiated security reviews based on allegations that appear to have been designed to neutralize your capabilities at a moment when those capabilities were most critically needed. The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment. I could see people glancing in my direction, their expressions ranging from curiosity to something that looked like shame. "We need you to listen to this transmission," General Morrison said, "and we need you to tell us what it means. Because right now, 12 American intelligence operatives are missing in hostile territory, and you may be the only person in the United States who can help us understand what happened to them." They played the transmission 3 times. The quality was poor, static-filled, interrupted by interference that made certain words difficult to distinguish. But the language was clear to me, as familiar as my own voice. "It's not standard walkie," I said when the recording finished. "It's Sarikoli walkie, a specific dialect spoken in the upper Tashkurgan Valley. The speaker is using formal register language, but with specific grammatical constructions that indicate extreme urgency." I paused, running the phrases through my mind again, checking my interpretation against the cultural contexts that gave the words their deeper meaning. The transmission is saying that the Northern Watchers have been invited to sleep beneath the old stones. In Sarikoli metaphorical language, that's a way of saying that foreign observers have been captured and are being held in a location associated with historical significance, probably caves or ruins that would have been used for similar purposes in the past. General Morrison leaned forward. "Captured by whom?"
"But here's what I can tell you," Dr. Webb said, his voice taking on a note of finality. "Your work for Project Babel has been critical to several ongoing operations that affect national security. You have been providing analysis that no one else in our contractor network can provide. And if certain people are going to significant lengths to neutralize your capabilities, that suggests your work is more valuable and more threatening to hostile interests than even we realized." As I hung up the phone, I realized that everything I thought I understood about the Pentagon briefing had been wrong. It wasn't just family dynamics or professional jealousy or Damien's need to protect his reputation by sacrificing mine. It was warfare, and I had been the target. The call came at 3:47 a.m., 6 days after Dr. Webb had turned my understanding of everything upside down. I recognized the number immediately, Pentagon main switchboard, and I answered on the first ring because you don't ignore calls from the Department of Defense at 3:47 in the morning, even when they've recently destroyed your career. "Miss Thorne," the voice was crisp, efficient, belonging to someone who was accustomed to delivering urgent information to people who weren't fully awake. "This is Colonel Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Communications Division. I need you to report to the Pentagon immediately for an emergency briefing. A car will be at your location in 20 minutes. I was still processing the fact that they were summoning me back to the building where I'd been professionally executed less than a week earlier when Colonel Hayes continued. "Ma'am, you should know that this is being classified as a national security emergency. The briefing you'll be attending is at the highest classification levels." 22 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of an unmarked government sedan, wearing the same blazer I'd worn to my destruction, trying to understand why the Pentagon would want me back when they'd made it clear that my services were not just unwanted, but potentially dangerous to national security. The Pentagon at 4:30 a.m. was a different building entirely. Gone were the bustling corridors filled with officials carrying important folders and having important conversations. Instead, the hallways were nearly empty, patrolled by security personnel who checked my credentials 3 separate times before escorting me to an elevator that required a key card I'd never seen before. The briefing room was smaller than the one where Damien had orchestrated my downfall, but the atmosphere was infinitely more intense. Instead of 12 officials seated around a polished conference table, there were perhaps 20 people clustered around workstations covered with computer monitors, satellite phones, and stacks of documents marked with classification levels that made my eyes water. At the center of it all stood General Patricia Morrison, the same woman who'd nodded approvingly while Damien systematically dismantled my reputation. But now her expression was grim, focused, carrying the weight of someone dealing with a crisis that was unfolding in real time. "Miss Thorne," she said as I entered, her voice cutting through the low buzz of urgent conversations. "Thank you for coming. We have a situation." She gestured to a wall-mounted display showing what appeared to be a map of Central Asia with various colored indicators scattered across the terrain. Approximately 6 hours ago, we lost contact with a joint intelligence gathering operation along the Afghan-Tajik border. The last communication we received was a burst transmission in Walkie, followed by complete radio silence. My stomach clenched as I realized why I'd been summoned back to the building where I'd been declared a security risk. "Our standard translation services," General Morrison continued, her voice taking on a note of barely controlled frustration, "have been unable to provide coherent interpretation of the transmission. The syntax doesn't match any known Walkie variants in our linguistic databases, and the vocabulary contains elements that our translators are categorizing as either coded language or dialect variations they can't identify." She turned to look directly at me, and I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen during the previous briefing. Respect, tinged with what might have been embarrassment. "Miss Thorne, I'm going to be frank with you. 6 days ago, this committee made a decision based on information that we now have reason to believe was incomplete and potentially manipulated. We terminated your contract and initiated security reviews based on allegations that appear to have been designed to neutralize your capabilities at a moment when those capabilities were most critically needed." The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment. I could see people glancing in my direction, their expressions ranging from curiosity to something that looked like shame. "We need you to listen to this transmission," General Morrison said, "and we need you to tell us what it means. Because right now, 12 American intelligence operatives are missing in hostile territory, and you may be the only person in the United States who can help us understand what happened to them." They played the transmission 3 times. The quality was poor, static-filled, interrupted by interference that made certain words difficult to distinguish. But the language was clear to me, as familiar as my own voice. "It's not standard Walkie," I said when the recording finished. "It's Semicircle Walkie, a specific dialect spoken in the upper Tashkurgan Valley. The speaker is using formal register language, but with specific grammatical constructions that indicate extreme urgency." I paused, running the phrases through my mind again, checking my interpretation against the cultural contexts that gave the words their deeper meaning. The transmission is saying that the Northern Watchers have been invited to sleep beneath the old stones. In Semicircle metaphorical language, that's a way of saying that foreign observers have been captured and are being held in a location associated with historical significance, probably caves or ruins that would have been used for similar purposes in the past. General Morrison leaned forward. "Captured by whom?"
"The speaker refers to those who speak with borrowed voices," I continued. "That's a traditional way of describing people who are working for foreign powers, acting on behalf of interests that aren't aligned with local communities. In current geopolitical context, it most likely refers to operatives working for non-American intelligence services." The implications of what I was telling them settled over the room like a heavy fog.
The missing American operatives hadn't just encountered hostile local forces, they'd been taken by foreign intelligence agents who were operating in the same region, possibly for the same reasons. "There's more," I said, rewinding my mental playback of the transmission. "The speaker says that the old paths are watched, but the Sky Road remains open. That's a reference to smuggling routes that avoid traditional ground-based border crossings. He's providing information about how to extract personnel without using standard escape routes." General Morrison exchanged glances with a man I didn't recognize, someone whose presence seemed to command automatic deference from everyone else in the room. "Miss Thorne," the stranger said, stepping forward with the kind of authority that made it clear he was accustomed to making decisions that affected international security, "I'm Director James Kirkland, National Clandestine Service. Can you determine from the transmission whether the speaker is providing this information voluntarily or whether he's being coerced?" I listened to the recording one more time, focusing not just on the words, but on the vocal patterns, the stress indicators, the subtle variations in tone that might reveal the speaker's emotional state. "Voluntarily," I said with certainty. "The stress patterns are consistent with someone who's choosing to take significant personal risk to provide important information. This isn't a coerced communication. It's someone who's deciding to help, knowing that the assistance could endanger him and his community." Director Kirkland nodded slowly. "That changes our tactical approach significantly. If we have a willing local asset providing intelligence, we can coordinate extraction operations that minimize risk to civilian populations." Over the next 4 hours, I provided detailed analysis of 17 additional intercepts that had been collected over the previous week, communications that NSA's standard translation services had categorized as routine civilian chatter revealed themselves to be a coordinated intelligence network that had been tracking foreign operative movements and providing warnings about threats to American personnel. The linguistic patterns I identified helped intelligence analysts understand that the missing American operatives weren't just being held by hostile forces, they were being protected by local communities who'd recognized them as American intelligence assets and were coordinating with other tribal networks to facilitate their safe extraction. By 9 a.m., rescue operations were underway. By noon, all 12 missing operatives had been recovered safely, along with intelligence materials that provided crucial information about foreign intelligence activities throughout the region. As the crisis center began to wind down, General Morrison approached me with an expression that was equal parts relief and regret. "Miss Thorne, I owe you an apology. This committee made decisions based on incomplete information, and those decisions nearly cost American lives. Your contract is being reinstated immediately, with full back pay and an upgrade to your security clearance level." I looked around the room at the faces that had condemned me 6 days earlier, now looking at me with the kind of respect that comes from watching someone perform under pressure in ways that save lives. "Furthermore," General Morrison continued, "we're implementing new protocols to ensure that decisions about linguistic contractors are made with full access to operational performance data. What happened to you will not happen to anyone else."
Director Kirkland stepped forward, extending his hand. "Miss Thorne, on behalf of the intelligence community, thank you. Your work today directly contributed to saving American lives and protecting ongoing operations that affect national security." As I shook his hand, I realized that this wasn't just professional vindication, it was something more profound. For the first time in my life, my linguistic abilities weren't being treated as interesting hobbies or academic curiosities. They were being recognized as critical capabilities that contributed directly to protecting people and advancing American interests. 3 months later, I received a letter from Damien. It was brief, formal, carrying the tone of someone who'd been required to write it rather than someone who'd chosen to reach out. In it, he acknowledged that he'd acted on incomplete information, that his assessment of my qualifications had been based on limited understanding of my actual work,
and that he regretted any personal or professional harm that had resulted from his actions. What the letter didn't say, what I learned through other channels, was that Damien's security clearance had been suspended pending investigation into how he'd obtained access to classified information about my work and personal background. The same bureaucratic machinery that had destroyed my career was now scrutinizing his, examining whether he'd been a willing participant in intelligence manipulation or simply an unwitting tool used by hostile actors. I never responded to his letter, not because I was angry, but because I realized that our relationship had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding that couldn't be corrected through correspondence. He'd spent our entire lives trying to protect me from my own impractical choices, never understanding that those choices had led me to develop capabilities that were more valuable than either of us had realized. Today, I work as a senior linguistic analyst for the National Security Agency, leading a team of specialists who provide cultural and linguistic analysis for intelligence operations throughout Central Asia and the broader region. My office walls are covered with maps showing places most Americans couldn't locate, decorated with awards for service that will never be publicly acknowledged. The work is challenging, meaningful, and occasionally dangerous in ways that I'm not permitted to discuss even with close friends. But it's also deeply satisfying, because every day I use skills that were once dismissed as useless hobbies to help protect people and advance understanding between cultures that too often see each other as threats, rather than potential partners. Sometimes when I'm working late on particularly complex translations, I think about that Pentagon briefing room and the faces of officials who'd been so certain that I was a liability rather than an asset. I think about how easy it is to destroy something valuable when you don't understand what makes it worth protecting. But mostly, I focus on the work itself, the daily practice of building bridges between languages and cultures, helping people understand each other across boundaries that seem insurmountable until someone takes the time to learn how to translate not just words, but the deeper meanings that make communication possible. My useless skills, it turns out, were exactly what the world needed. It just took a crisis to help everyone else realize what I'd known all along.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.